I think I was morally, physically, spiritually bankrupt. I mean, I woke up after another long, hard night, and this one was different. I had Lauren basically very calmly and collectively and dispassionately was like, "Hey, you're not safe here. I love you, and I'll stick by you and I'll support you, but you can't be around me or the kids." And it was April 15th of 2018 when I hit rock bottom. I was so burnt out and exhausted from trying to white knuckle the world around me into being as I would have it. Right before I would black out every night, I would just get this little bit where I wasn't telling myself what a piece of crap I was, or what a failure I was, or how if anybody really knew who I was, they wouldn't like me. Lauren and I come from intact families, and divorce isn't an option, and here I was just running my life into the dirt. I was successful, I had a good job, I made money, I had a house, I had a wife, I had kids, I had cars, and so I didn't really feel like I had fallen to that rock bottom or living under a bridge or whatever you want to call it. I didn't know how to process all this, and I didn't know who to bring it to, so I thought I would end my life. And so I ended up, I couldn't go home. I didn't have anywhere else to go. I didn't know who to call. I didn't know how to get help. And so I was like, I'll just shoot myself and the girls, and Lauren will be better without me creating chaos all around them. So I was sitting in a truck and had the gun in my lap, and a mockingbird landed on my rearview mirror on the side of the truck, and I didn't have a lot of life verses to hang on to, but I remembered that one in Matthew 6 about, consider the birds. They don't put away in barns, they don't store for the winter, and yet, God feeds them, and aren't you more valuable than they? And I decided not to do it, and I called a friend of mine that I'd known had been in Alcoholics Anonymous for like 20 years, and he encouraged me to go get help, and so I did. That 30 days of time and space in late April, early May of 2018 gave me a framework and a solution that I don't think I could have ever found on my own. I didn't know what life would look like. I figured I wouldn't have a job when I got back. I mean, that was the narrative in my head, was that I would have some weird scarlet letter around me, and that all of my friends would leave me or push me away, and that my wife would move on and my kids wouldn't know me, and I'm blowing my life up by bringing this out into the light. When I finally moved forward and said, man, I want to get help, people just came out of the woodwork, and people that I had known for years that I didn't know were sober or didn't know lived their life without alcohol. And it was like you had this strength and this group around you that I'd never had before. And the thing that I loved about it so much was it was like everybody pulled their mask off. And it was the first place I'd ever been in life where everybody was laying themselves bare and really getting honest about the things that they faced and the struggles that they wrestled with. And they really made surrender seemed like a position of strength. And when I finally let go and just let other people drive for a little while, that pointed me toward this God that could do for me what I could not do for myself, that can be a source of peace and strength and something that I can't muster through my own effort. I do believe that my story really is like what it was like, and then what happened, and what it's like now. And I have a son I would have never met, and I have a job I never would have had, and I have close friendships that are connected in something much deeper and larger than even I could have ever written down or imagined. It's a strange thing to be grateful for, but I'm so grateful that I recognized I had a problem. I was so beat down and didn't care who knew at that point. And I reached out for help, and the help came running. That's what this community did for me.
Amen. Yeah, you can applaud that. I'm just unbelievably thankful for Preston and his willingness to share his real story. As a friend, he's taught me so much about what it means to be real with one another, and him taking that step of being willing to share today is something I hope that positions you to be able to be honest about where you are today. And as we dive through this series, I'm going to do just a quick recap like we've done over the last couple of weeks to just get us all on the same page, especially if you haven't been here the last couple of weeks. We're in this series on mental health called Not Alone. We're calling that because a lot of times with mental health, we think we're the only ones that are struggling with these things. But the reason we're doing this is, one, we want to break the silence. Two, we want to remove the stigma. And three, we want to affirm what God says about us. And if you struggle with some of these things, you need to remember that you are not alone and that most of us are actually like the rest of us, right? In so many ways. In the Bible, it doesn't hide these stories. It doesn't pretend these kind of things aren't real. If you look through the scriptures, you'll see in so many different ways. King David was depressed. Solomon hated life. Job was hopeless. Elijah was suicidal. Jeremiah wished he had never been born. And then you look at Jesus, and you can go back to the Old Testament, and there's this passage there called the Shema. And in the Shema, it's like kind of the central teachings of what it means to follow God. And it says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And then fast forward to the New Testament, and Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he puts a little extension on that. And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. And Jesus understood the importance of thinking about what we think about. Right? It's important that we pay attention to the thoughts that we have, because those thoughts become the narratives that we live into. The things that we fill our minds with shape and form the actions that we put out into this world. And so paying attention to these things matters greatly. As we've talked over the last couple of weeks about anxiety and depression, and we know that we said anxiety, it's like we want to live in this center shalom peace with God, but anxiety tends to pull us towards the future, tends to give us a God complex where we think we need to control every outcome, everything that sits before us, everything that's ever going to happen. Depression tends to pull us to the back, right? What if? What if you did this? Why did you do this? You shouldn't have done that. You're not good enough. You're not this. Your parents said this, and you remember those words, and they kind of they neutralize us instead of mobilize us, and we move out of this center of peace. We can just live like this in so many ways. And so today, on this third week, we're going to be talking about suicide. And as we talk about this, we just need to acknowledge that it is very real. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention did a massive study in 2021 and found that 48,183 Americans died by suicide that year. Said another way, 1 every 11 minutes. 12.3 million Americans thought about suicide that year. 1.7 million attempted it. And if it was up to me, I'd say that the church should be the safest place in the world to say that we're not okay, right? It should be the place where we come in and show up and say, listen, these are the challenges, these are the struggles, right? We need help, and this should be a place where we do not judge, where we do not lean into that, but there's a place that says, hey, you are welcome here, and we are for you, and we want to help you live God's best for your life. And so as we wrestle with that, it's important for us as a church to say, hey, how do we do this? And how do we understand that? Because the first thing we have to understand is that anxiety, depression, mental health, it does not discriminate. It impacts all of us. And as we've talked about anxiety, that can tend to make us feel not good enough. But the reality is anxiety is not a sin. Anxiety is a signal. It's a signal that something is broken, something is off, something is not right. Something's pulling us to the future. Something's causing us to sort of play this God complex. How can we let go, trust God in those places, and what does that look like? And as we talk about this as well, we've said feeling depressed doesn't mean you lack faith any more than being happy means you have it, right? And sometimes these issues are so complex, whether it's chemical issues, whether it's psychological issues, whether it's relational issues, whether it's circumstantial issues, whether it's past things, whether it's worries about the future. There's so many formulas that lead to the situations we find ourselves in that there really is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to this stuff. And that's part of the challenge, is the complexity of it. And for so many of us, we just want to reduce things to black and white and make it so simple and say, well, why don't you just go outside and go for a walk? Right? Because the complexity of it is so hard for us to deal with in so many ways. And so the reality is that when these things bubble up, we tend to hide them. We tend to put masks over them, as Preston used that phrase, right? You can go back to the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 1, and you have perfect union with God. Sin enters the world. Adam and Eve look around, realize they're naked, and the first thing they do is they start to cover themselves up. And they start to put these masks on. And they start to put this barrier between them and the other people around them. And as we look at that, in that sense, that same tendency is still there for us, right? That as humans, when something gets difficult, when something gets hard, when it's brought up, there's a tendency to say, oh, not me, we're great. We're having a great day, right? And like we just kind of like put that mask on. And we pretend everything's okay even when it isn't. And that's such a pull of human nature in so many ways. But the reality is that God operates in the light, and bringing hard things to the light is a grace that we have been given. And so as we talk about suicide today, our hope is to just put it in the light in a couple different ways. One, we're going to look at some things in the scripture around this. Number two, I want to talk to those of you who are dealing with people who have experienced this, in families and extended families, and how we as a church and how we as the people of God can respond to these kind of situations well. For those of you who have been directly impacted by someone close to you who died by suicide, we're going to talk about that for a second. And then we're going to spend a few minutes talking about those of us that maybe have had some harmful thoughts and what a path forward might look like for that for ourselves. So the first thing I want to do is go to scriptures. And 2 Corinthians chapter 4 is where we're going to start. And this is a letter by the Apostle Paul. And as he writes this letter, I want to give you just a little context to who Apostle Paul is. Okay, so he was one of these first generation church builders. Okay, he understands the reality of Jesus. He understands the reality of the resurrection. He understands that if Jesus is really real, everything about the world is going to be really different. And so he begins this movement of the local church. And he's one of these pioneering church planters that plants churches literally all over the known world. And he's in this place, he's popping up churches, he's leading these groups of people, he's leading all these different situations and circumstances, and he is sort of seen as like the guy. Okay? And so as he's getting ready to do this, and he's sharing this, the way that he would communicate to a lot of these churches, because he didn't have airplanes, he didn't have Zoom, and so it was really hard to communicate with a lot of these churches. And what he would do is he would write these letters to these churches. And these letters are a lot of the New Testament letters that we have, or these letters written back and forth to the churches from Paul, and his encouragement to them, his teaching to them, and his challenges to them. And so in this particular one, in 1 Corinthians in chapter 4, where it starts, there's this unique little passage where Paul is talking about this. And as many people have been around this passage, it's kind of like a semi-famous passage. Okay? And it says this. It says, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." And if you were a 90s church kid, you started singing that song. Right? And we've heard this over and over, and this phrase has been used. A lot of people, it's kind of like an anchor verse that they come back to in so many different ways, and they lean into in so many different ways. And so as we look at this, it's important to hear what he says, right? He's like, hey, hard pressed on every side, not crushed, perplexed, not despair, persecuted, not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. There's a lot of hope in those words. And there's a sense of like, hey, I feel that. I get that. I know what that could be like. But when we go to chapter 1, if you back up just a little bit, you see that Paul didn't always feel this way. Okay, in chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, he says, listen, we don't want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. And essentially what he's saying is like, hey, I'm going to pull the mask off. He's like, hey, I want you to know, like, I'm the leader, I'm the church planter, started all the churches, I'm the thing, I've been commissioned, I've been sent, I'm the guy. But he's like, I want you to know that even in my position of authority, even in the position that God has placed me in, all the success we've seen, all the beautiful things that we've seen happen, he's like, I want you to know that everything ain't perfect in my world. And he starts off and he says, so listen, I want you to hear about the troubles we had in the province of Asia. And he says, we were under great pressure. And listen to this, far beyond our ability to endure. He's like, I just got to a place where I was like at the end of he's like, we couldn't do this. Like Preston said, like, end of my rope. Like this was rock bottom. He's like, we just couldn't do this anymore. And he says it was far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. He's like, man, I was just ready to give up. He's like, this is unbelievably hard. And he says, indeed, we'd felt we had received the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. And so as you look at this, you can kind of put chapter 4 and chapter 1 side by side. And what you see up here is chapter 1 says, hey, we have a pressure beyond the ability to endure. In chapter 4, when you get a little later, it says, hey, listen, pressed but not crushed. Right? Chapter 1 says we despaired of life itself, but a little later in the story, hey, perplexed but not in despair. Chapter 1, we received the sentence of death. A little later in the story, hey, struck down but not destroyed. And so one thing that we need to understand when it comes to these self-harm thoughts and when it comes to all of these challenges that show up in so many ways is that feelings are not permanent. And so often we can get caught up and we can get in this cloud of this is what is true, this is what has been said in the past, this is what's going to happen in the future. These are all the things. And Jesus is like, love the Lord with your mind. You got to think about the things you think about. And as we said a couple weeks ago from Martin Luther, right? We can't control the birds that fly by, but we can control the ones that build a nest. Right? And we shake that nest out of our head, and there becomes this place where we've got to step back and say, hey, these feelings are not permanent. And the way that we can do that oftentimes, I think, is to remember the past. Today is November 10th. What were you mad about November 10th last year? Right? That past. What were you mad about November 10th 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? And in the moment of that stuff, right, it feels so heavy. And it feels so real. And how can we ever get out of this, right? Some of you guys maybe can relate to this, right? You had a crush in high school and you're like going to ask him to a dance and like your whole world hinged on that answer, right? Everything was about that, the whole life. And I'll tell you, I had somebody like that, can't remember her last name anymore. Right? Like those feelings, they feel so big in the moment, but like they're going to pass. And for us to remember that and to remember the faithfulness of God and the faithfulness of others around us. And so as we talk about suicide, as we talk about these issues, as we talk about these self-harm thoughts in so many different ways, it's good for us to distinguish myth between fact. Okay, one myth is that talking about it encourages it. But the reality is that fears shared are more likely to diminish. Another myth, you can't change people's mind. But the fact is, people can be helped and that change is possible. A question that, as we shared that we're going to be talking about this today, that came up multiple times, was somebody said, if somebody dies by suicide, can they still go to heaven? And what I would say to that is that our salvation is not based on our performance, full stop. Our salvation is not based on our performance. And you see, when it comes to Jesus and his love, there's nothing that can separate us from that. In baptism, we go from life to death, and that there is no mess too messy for Jesus. There is no sin, past, present, or future, that is bigger than the work of Jesus on the cross. And when we see that, when we know that, when we believe that, we can rest in that. And so one of the things that I did this week that I thought was really interesting was I've met, over the last couple weeks really, I've met with a lot of families in our church who have experienced somebody in their immediate family who had died by suicide. And as I talked to them, I just said, hey, this is what I'd love for you to do. I'd love for you to help our church as a whole just get better at dealing with this. At talking about it, at coming alongside people who have wrestled with this, who have walked through this as a part of their own story. And I said, tell me some things that you would say, people, it's helpful when people do this, and it's helpful when people don't do this. Okay, and everybody's different, so this is not a black and white list, but I think it is a helpful list to get our wheels turning as we think about this, because so often this is something that we talk so little about, that so many of us feel so equipped to step into a situation around it, that when it does happen, we sort of go in protecting ourselves instead of trying to help others. Right? And so we sort of go in and we're like, well, I'm not going to stay long. I'm going to like rehearse what I'm going to say. And like we sort of go in with this approach of like, how can I not screw up versus how can I help them? And it often leads to some awkward encounters. And so as we look at this, I think it's helpful to hear from these folks. And I kind of wordsmithed them into 3 big umbrellas. And you can see these up here on the screen. It says, 1, platitudes don't hold a candle to presence. Yeah, the sense of just saying, hey, listen. Like, you can come with the right lines, you can come with the right phrases, but that doesn't hold a candle to presence. Number 2, we can't give shallow answers to complex realities. So often we just want to have like a tweet that's like 2 sentences that'll be like, yeah, that was a good zinger, wasn't it? Did that help? And the reality is that's more about us feeling like we did something than it is about actually being helpful, because the complex realities of this are extremely challenging. Number 3, empathy is the killer of shame. Then when we can say, oh, you know, we've struggled with this too. We've felt this too. We've been in these places before. That there's a sense that there's a freedom that comes with that. And so I just want to give you some kind of like rapid fire highlights of things that people have shared with me that I thought were really helpful to share with y'all, so that we as a church can get better at walking alongside people who are struggling with these issues. Number 1, how we talk about it matters deeply. Died by suicide is appropriate way to talk about it versus committed suicide. And here's the best way that I can kind of just summarize that for you. No one you know committed cancer. Right? And when we understand it from that perspective and we see that, hey, this is a culmination of a lot of complex events that led to this, right? They died by suicide, not committed suicide, is an extremely graceful way to talk about it. Suicide is often perceived as selfish, one person told me. I thought this was extremely insightful. They said, but often in other people's heads, they're actually operating under the assumption that they are not being selfish, but they're actually doing everyone in the world a favor by getting rid of the burden that is them. And you heard Preston say those words, I just wanted to set my family free from the mess that was me. Right? And that becomes what starts to happen. And so when we think of that as someone did something selfish, when we go to walk alongside the family, the way we approach that family is if we're helping them walk a path of someone who did something selfish versus walking along the path of someone who passed away at the culmination of a very complex situation. The way we approach that is very different the way we perceive it. And so we need to understand the complexity of it and that it isn't selfish. Suicide's not a joke. Casually talking about suicide's not funny. And saying things like, oh, I'd kill myself if that ever happened to me. Saying that as a joke is so unbelievably hurtful to someone who has lost someone close to them. And a huge thing that you can do to help is to begin to say things like that to your children when you hear those phrases being said. And you say, hey, we don't do that. We don't talk like that. Some things that were not helpful. Asking, what happened? How did they die? When somebody knows that they died by suicide, to show up and say, well, tell me the story, what happened? And somebody wrote me a really good little paragraph about this I want to share with you. They said, I can't tell you how often people, even still several years later, ask me, what happened? How did it happen? When people asked this in the beginning, I'd fall apart. It took me years to even say the word suicide. And here's why the question, what happened, isn't helpful. It's usually from a stranger who I haven't had the willingness to be vulnerable with yet up to this point. And now I have to end up having this very vulnerable conversation with someone who I haven't built trust with. When this happens, it actually re-traumatizes the suicide survivor and keeps him or her stuck in the fight, flight, or freeze response, not giving them the space to heal. It is not helpful, and it just isn't a stranger's business to know the details about how your loved one died so early in life. Somebody sent me a great list of phrases that people had said that were not helpful. And so I thought these were really good for you to hear. Saying it will get better with time. That's true, but it's not helpful in the beginning. I'm so glad you have other children. Very true. Doesn't change the loss. They are in a better place. True, but discounts the pain that they are not here. God needed them more than we did. Not helpful. Don't you love their writing? Not helpful to ask. How could they have done this? Suicide is so complex and so many unanswered questions remain. What happened? Sounds innocent, but it's not one thing. Ever and often, it's a question that cannot be answered simply. One person told me that it was very helpful to them that when people would intentionally ask questions about the person's life and not their death. And say, hey, tell me just about the way the Lord used them in their life. Tell me about them when they were at their best. Tell me about them when they were a kid. Tell me about them when they made you laugh. Tell me about them when you get into these places. And to be able to tap into that side of the person is extremely helpful in healing. And so how can we help? When people ask that question, a lot of folks said people would call and say, hey, what can we do? What do you need? Or they said text. And they would say, oftentimes we don't know what we need. And to be able to just show up and to be there and to be present is unbelievably helpful. One person shared with me, they said, people running to Target and grabbing us everyday things and dropping them off at our house was unbelievably helpful because we did not have the time, the space, or the mental presence to go to Target and get the things we get at Target. And they said just toilet paper, paper towels, shampoo, just everyday things to just drop those off and to solve those burdens and take them off of them were completely helpful. And so you hear all these things of what not to say. And there are some things that you can say that are helpful. Things like helpful to say, I have no idea how you feel. Somebody said, hey, it's helpful to say it's okay to be angry. It's helpful to say to us there's no perfect way to grieve. It's helpful to hear us, to have people say to us, we all grieve differently. And it's a gift to have people acknowledge that and people to just show up and simply be present. Now, when I was in high school, I went to a Catholic high school. And we would have dances all the dances that you have in high school. And we had this priest that he was always famous to say to all of us on our basketball team before we went into the dances, to when we danced, leave room for the Holy Spirit. And the same can be true said when you're walking with people through grief. Like, leave some room for the Holy Spirit. Like, you don't have to talk 24/7. Sometimes just being present and being there and being still in that moment can be an unbelievable gift for people to just know they are loved. Sometimes you just have to show me, not tell me, right? And to be present with people in their times of grief is so unbelievably helpful. Now, if I can shift gears for a minute and talk to those of you who have lost someone to suicide. If I could say a few things to you, I'd say, one, don't blame yourself. There's only so much you can do, and when we can't take responsibility for other people's outlook or agency. And we live with some shame around that, and there's no shame around so many of these issues, but people generally don't want life to end, but they want the pain to end, and you have to know that you were not the pain. Right? And so often we think, man, if I could have done this, if I could have fixed this, if I could have showed up in this place, how different it all would have been, right? And I think that maybe in your grief journey, that's helpful to spend a minute there and to let that thought fly by. But to let those thoughts build nests is not helpful. And here's one way that I think this is helpful for me to understand. In our culture, a lot of people watch football. And oftentimes at the end of the game, it'll come down to a kicker, and we'll say things like they have to make this kick to win the game. And the reality is if they make that kick, the game does get won. But they also sometimes say that without acknowledging that the quarterback threw 3 interceptions, the running back fumbled several times, there was a few first downs that was missed, the clock management was terrible, and now we're in a situation where the kicker has to make this kick. The kicker didn't lose the game. Right? And so many of us, I think we often think about that last interaction with somebody we lost, and we think like we're the ones that lost the game. But the reality is, again, it goes back to us wanting to create this reductionist, black and white, simplistic view that makes sense of it all. But it's so much more complex than that. And there is grace upon grace. And God's grace is like water. It flows to the lowest points in our lives. And if you feel like that's the lowest point in your life, allow God's grace to meet you in that place and receive it. If you're hurting, what I would say to you is, one, know the number 988 is always there on any phone, and you can dial, and that's a national suicide hotline. And if you're struggling with those kind of thoughts, those self-harm thoughts, and as you wrestle with this, I want to give you as much empathy as I can for a second and say that I thought the other day, well, I'm going to give out this 988 number in the service. I probably ought to call it and know what happens. So I'm going to call them and just talk to them and tell them thanks for what they're doing and glad that this is an option here, but I just want to go through the process, make sure it worked, see if it worked on my phone, all those kind of things. And so I grabbed out my phone and I went to dial 988, and honestly, I just paused. And I was like, oh, wow, this is a lot. And as I dialed 988, I literally just kind of felt my heart rate go up a little bit. And I thought, I'm just calling to test it, and it's complicated. And so for somebody who's got to make that call, I just want you to say and we get how hard that is, but I also believe that your life is worth it and you are strong enough, and that there are so many people that want to surround you and help you. And so grace plus truth plus time is kind of a little formula we've been using over these couple weeks. And if you've been struggling with these kind of thoughts, I want to just talk through grace, through truth, through time with you for 1 second. Grace. God loves you, not a future, more perfected version of you. If God only used perfect people, nothing would ever get done. Okay? I want to tell you this story real quick that I stumbled on this week. I thought it was so beautiful. There's this pianist, jazz pianist named Keith Jarrett. And you see his picture up here, and you're going to hear his music in just a second. It's going to start playing. And Keith, he is kind of this renowned perfectionist when it comes to his music. And so he was one of those musicians that always had the rider that they would give out before the concert to say, this is everything I need in order for me to show up and to do my job well. And so he was going to this concert in Cologne, Germany. And as the day of the concert approached, the promoter of the concert actually called him and was like, hey, so listen, a lot of things fell apart. They're a lot of things you asked for aren't going to be here. One of them, which is really important, is a piano that's in tune will not be here. And they said, we've tried everything, we've went through every avenue, and it is just not going to work out. There is a piano, but it's broken on one end, and it stumbles, and it's out of tune. And so he was furious. He's like, I'm not playing, I'm done, not going to show up, not doing this concert. The promoter apparently was a pretty good salesperson and just leaned back and was like, here, we got it, we'll give you more money. I don't know what exactly happened, but somehow they talked him into showing up and playing the concert. But he said, okay, I'll come and I'll play the concert, but under one condition. I need to be able to record this concert so that I can send it to every venue I play in the future so that they can know this is what happens if you don't follow my rules, and you're going to get a terrible performance that sounds just like this. And they were like, deal. So they record the concert. He shows up, sits down, and he ad-libs for about 60 minutes this jazz concert by himself, where he meanders around these broken keys, begins to use these broken keys, works them into his set. Some people say it was the greatest performance he ever had, and it's his highest selling album of all time. And I think kind of just what we take away from that is a broken instrument in the hands of a master can produce beautiful things. And if you think I'm so out of tune, I'm so useless, I'm so broken, open up your Bible and read any story from beginning to end, and what you find is God using broken people who thought they were incapable of bringing any good to this world to tell his story from beginning to end. And the scriptures tell us that God was the same yesterday, today, in the future. And so we know that that is the way the Lord works. And if you feel like you are useless, you are not of value, God could never use me, I'm so broken, understand that. A broken instrument in the hands of a master can create beautiful things. And as much as I'd love to just let this play background music the whole rest of the time, we'll turn it off. Truth, you're not alone, and this too shall pass. Hebrews 13:5, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Emotions are different than facts. Thinking it does not make it true. I love the mountains, I love the winter, I keep dressing for the fall, believing it is gonna be here, and it is not. Right, as much as I want that to be true, I'm like sweating, right? As much as I want that to be true, it's not. Permanent solutions to a temporary problem don't add up. And so when you start talking negative thoughts about yourself and you're getting into that place, my buddy Preston, who you saw in the video, he said this to me this week. I thought it was so good. He said, when your negative thoughts get to a place where if another human was saying those words to you, you would punch them, you need to make sure that you're not letting that voice take up residency in your head. And if the voice in your head is not first whispering love, grace, mercy, and affection, do not buy it. If that voice in your head is not the voice of a lovesick parent running fervently towards a child who has come home just like the prodigal son came home, then something is missing big time. Third thing I'd say, grace plus truth plus time. The time is that there is so much more that God has for you. Right? Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10 says we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for you to do. And if you're struggling with these kind of thoughts, I hope you know that you have a future. That God will use you. You are not worthless, and there is so much life in front of you. There are so many people who want to walk through life with you. And a couple weeks ago, I was heading over to Port St. Joe. Mark, Clint, y'all can come up. I was heading over to Port St. Joe to shoot that little video that we shared with y'all with Preston. And I stopped at Grayton Corners, kind of down in Grayton over there, to get a little biscuit in the morning. And Mark was there in line in front of me. And so we were just chatting. I said, hey, man, I'm actually on my way over to Port St. Joe. Preston's a mutual friend of ours. I said, we're going to go and shoot a little video. He's going to share his story and talk about that. And Mark just kind of paused and grabbed me. He said, man, I'm so glad we're going to be talking about this as a church and just removing some of the stigma and bringing this out front. And he said, one of my best friends died by suicide. And he started to tell me that story. And as he told me that, I just texted him a few minutes after we'd met in the car. I said, I just feel like you need to come tell this to the whole church, because people need to know that a permanent solution to a temporary problem is not the answer. And as you may think in those self-harm thoughts and those cycles that start to come that show up that, everybody wants to just get rid of me. Everybody wants to be done with me. How untrue that is. And I thought Mark's story about his buddy is just a beautiful picture of that. And so I want you to hear a little bit about this over the next couple minutes. So Mark, how you doing?
Anxious. Honestly, yep. The earlier service was not as crowded as this one. So I told them that...
next one's the big one. So.
I know. I said I write better than I play better than I sing, and sing a little better than I figure skate. So we'll see how this goes.
That's pretty good, man. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your buddy Gardner and his story?
Yeah, Gardner Crew was my best friend since we were in 6th grade together, and saw each other through highs and lows of life over the next 30-something years. Got to see his children be born, marriages, divorced, unfortunately. He was just a great guy, kept a lot of things inside, as we found out later. And he died by suicide about 11 years ago. And it's left a hole, not just in my life, but a ton of people. The ripple effect of what you mentioned earlier about thinking years after he passed, she asked me to participate in her wedding for her dad, stand in for him. And so I was honored to do that. And this song just dropped from, I think, him in heaven and said, hey, I want you to give this gift to my daughter.
Before you play it, can you talk a little bit about your story?
Yeah, so when we were meeting to discuss this, I brought up to Brad that I am a cancer survivor, and it's okay for me to tell people that, because what comes along with sharing a story of survival and fighting cancer is you want people praying for you, you want people pulling for you and offering help. But with mental illness and suicide, things like that, it comes with a stigma where cancer comes with sympathy. And I think that if you tell your truth about what you're struggling with, you'll find sympathy, and hopefully we can get rid of that stigma.
What would you say to somebody struggling?
I'd say call me. I mean, anytime. I mean, there's a lot of people in here that know me. And if it's not me, call someone, reach out, tell your story. I guarantee you, you're not alone. I promise you that people empathize with what you're going through.
That's good. So in the South, there's kind of this expression around weddings that says you need to have
something old, something borrowed, something new, and something blue. And so this song that I think Gardner Crew sent to me is called Something Blue. Strand of pearls, a store-bought diamond ring, heirloom wedding veil, flowing as the choir sings. Got something old, something bought, something new. Well, I'll be your something blue. Well, don't get me wrong, he'd be glad you found one. Oh, an arm around his shoulder, over a beard, say welcome, son. For his baby girl, no boy would ever do. He'd be your something blue. Well, I wish that he was here to walk you down the aisle, shed a couple tears and manage that crooked smile. He'd kiss you on the cheek and shake that lucky boy's hand. Take a seat in that old wooden pew. Well, he'd be your something blue. We'll raise a toast somewhere in the back, just as memory and me, and an engraved silver flask. Watch as you leave for your honeymoon. We'll be your something blue. Yeah, I wish that he was here. He would be so proud of his baby girl. Became the woman she is now. So just look up to heaven and see what he did for you. He couldn't give you away, so he gave you something blue. Something blue. Yeah, he gave you something blue.
thank you all for sharing that and just your vulnerability in it. And also thanks to Gardner's family for letting us share that story as well. We reached out to them before we did that. And I hope if you've had those thoughts, you just hear that song and remember, man, there's a lot of consequences come on the other side of that. And a lot of people love you, a lot of people care for you, a lot of people want good for you. And what we wanted to do as we wrap up this series this afternoon is to just make it as easy as possible for all of us to say, if we're moving that direction in any way, that the truth is there's things that we can do to kind of steer that ship of our life a little bit. And so on your seats, you got these cards there. And what our hope and our prayer this morning is that everybody would participate in this, because if somebody is struggling and it's really hard for them to fill out this card and say they need help and come forward, that we want to make that as easy as possible, because we're just all going to do it, okay? And so if you find yourself in a really healthy spot at the top, you can just check that box that says, hey, I'm committed to reach out to somebody in my circle this week and ask them how they're doing. Like, I just want to be a part of the solution. And just those simple conversations. Who's been a little absent lately? Who's been checked out? Like, how can I just check in? You never know what that phone call, that text of encouragement can do for somebody. Second, to say, you know what, like, I don't feel these things fully yet, but like the reality is we moved to town, we're kind of isolated, we don't know a lot of people, and like if life stayed like it stayed for the last season for a long time, like it isn't going a good path. And for some of you, you might just need to say, hey, like I'd love to be in a group to build some community with some other Christians so I can get to know some people, I can have a place, I can start to build a network and build a relationship. Third thing says, hey, the reality is over these last couple weeks, as we've been talking about these things, I really do kind of struggle with some of this stuff. And I'd love to look for a path forward. I'd love to meet with somebody over the next week or two about saying, hey, this is what I'm feeling. What are some good next steps that you would recommend? And a bunch of people on our team are willing to have those conversations with you. And then that last one, it just says, hey, listen, the reality is like, I need some help, like today. And I've thought these thoughts, this is not what I want, and like today's just the day I'm going to name that. I'm going to bring it into the light, and I'm going to let people know that I'm fearfully, wonderfully made. I'm going to remember that. I'm going to remember that God is for, God is with, God is in me. I'm going to believe that my church loves me and cares for me, so I'm just going to say this out loud, and I'm going to let my church come around and love me. And we got some pastors lined up today. They're just going to give you a call right away if you want to say, hey, I need some help right now. And we want to set that up for you as well. And so I think what makes this work, what makes this beautiful, and this is such a principle in life, right, is that like empathy and loving others is a shame killer. So for each of us to say, you know what, even if I'm good right now, like I'm going to stand up and I'm going to come forward and I'm going to drop this in, because I want to create as good and safe of an environment for somebody who is struggling to be able to say they need that help. And so Reggie and Katie are going to lead us in a song, and you're welcome to stay seated for a couple minutes. And when you feel appropriate, just stand up, come. You can drop these in the bucket down here. You're welcome to kneel at these altars and take a minute and pray for yourself. Maybe pray some of those bird nests away that maybe are taking up residence in your head. Pray for somebody in your family. Pray for somebody you know is struggling. Or maybe even to just take a minute and pray for somebody that you've lost and just give thanks to God for their life and for the impact that they made on you and the way that God used them and is bringing good out of the most difficult circumstances and situations around. And so, Reggie,